Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar that's offered jointly by the Mobilize Center and Restore Centers at Stanford University. My name is Matt Petrucci. I'm the scientific program manager of both of these centers, and I'm excited to serve as your moderator today. Today's speaker is Kate Clancy, who will be discussing her recent work to generate muscle-driven simulations for cycling. The first part of the webinar will cover her OpenSim modeling pipeline for cycling and the results of her study. She will demonstrate her team's approach to generating simulations using OpenSim Moco and how they explore different optimization objectives to improve similarity with experimental data. In the second half of the webinar, she will discuss best practices for and share lessons learned from working with OpenSim Moco. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Mobilize Center and Restore Centers, which are both supported by the National Institutes of Health. The Mobilize Center is focused on developing and disseminating state-of-the-art biomechanics and machine learning tools for researchers to analyze human movement. The Restore Center is working to make these and other tools for real-world assessment of movement more widely available to the rehab research community. Before we get started, a couple quick reminders about the webinar. We will have a research talk and then a best practice session, and we'd love to take your questions from both. We'll take your questions at the end of the research talk and at the end of the best practice session. And please type your questions into the Q&A panel in Zoom, so not the chat, and we'll review them from there. One other thing to note is this webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channels. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. As Kate Clancy is currently a senior modeling simulation engineer at Johnson & Johnson in the surgical robotics division. She is passionate about using computational modeling, simulation, and analysis to solve problems in medical and healthcare technology. Kate received her MS in mechanical engineering at Stanford University with concentrations in biomechanics and materials and stress analysis. And she received her BS in mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Her graduate school research centered on computational musculoskeletal modeling and simulation using optical control methods with OpenSim. Prior to graduate school, she worked in industry as a mechanical structural analysis using finite element analysis methods. So with that, we're all excited to have you here today, and I know we're excited to hear Kate speak about her research, so I'll let her go ahead and begin.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Today, I am going to be talking about our recent paper titled Muscle-Driven Simulations and Experimental Data of Cycling. This talk is going to be split into two parts, with the first part going over motivation, modeling pipeline, and some key results. And then the second part of the talk will center on some best practices and tips for using OpenSim Moco. So let's get started. Cycling is ubiquitous in our daily lives, whether it be in rehabilitation, transportation, or sport and leisure. And there has been a lot of research to characterize cycling, from joint angles to joint moments to pedal forces and muscle activations. There has also been research to study the effects of changing the cadence, the power output, and the bike fit. And all of this research has been done over a really wide range of cadences, power outputs, and cycling experience. Musculoskeletal modeling allows us to gain deeper insights into movement and helps us with estimating some of those hard to measure biomechanical quantities, such as muscle forces, joint forces, and muscle tendon lengths and velocities. And this musculoskeletal modeling starts with experimental data collection. As you can see here, we have some motion capture, as well as measurement of reaction forces, in this case, ground reaction forces. And from this experimental data collection, we can get positions. Next, we can use musculoskeletal modeling software, such as OpenSim, to calculate our joint angles using inverse kinematics. Next, we can get joint moments using inverse dynamics. And finally, we can use optimization methods to estimate muscle forces. Three examples of optimization methods in OpenSim include static optimization, computed muscle control, and OpenSim Moco. Static optimization is a fast method to estimate muscle forces from joint moments. However, it does not include muscle tendon dynamics as it is time independent and each frame is solved one at a time. One example of some great research that uses static optimization is the work done by Demers and their group, in which they study how different muscle coordination strategies while walking can result in tibiofemoral contact forces. Computed muscle control estimates muscle forces using forward integration with feed forward and feedback controls in order to match the desired input set of kinematics. And this includes muscle tendon dynamics, so we can more accurately estimate the muscle tendon lengths and velocity states. However, there's limited flexibility in problem setup, as during the optimization, we are only able to minimize muscle activation squared. A great example of the research that uses computed muscle control is a work done by Hamner and their group, in which they studied the muscle contributions to accelerations while running. They also shared their model for other researchers to use. Opens and MoCo estimates muscle forces with direct collocation, which is a modern trajectory optimization method. However, the researcher doesn't have to implement direct collocation themselves to use Opens and MoCo. And this Opens and MoCo, or MoCo, includes muscle tendon dynamics, but the real pro of Opens and MoCo is the flexibility. So if we look to the figure on the right, we have an input of our OpenSim model, and then optional inputs of external forces, such as those ground reaction forces, muscle activity, such as measured electromyography or EMG data, as well as marker data. And then we also have the flexibility with different optimization goals, or a set of goals. So we could minimize those muscle excitations or activations, and we could also minimize joint loading, as shown here, in order to estimate our muscle forces to produce that motion. And so we present our three-dimensional muscle-driven musculoskeletal modeling pipeline of cycling. And that modeling pipeline starts with experimental data collection of 16 participants. For each participant, we create a participant-specific scaled model to go along with the motion capture data. And then using inverse kinematics, or IK, we can generate our kinematics. Next, we use RRA, or the residual reduction algorithm, to minimize the dynamic inconsistency between kinematics and kinetics. And what we get are kinematics in a dynamically adjusted model. Next, we can use MoCo, or OpenSim MoCo, the direct collocation optimization method, in order to estimate muscle forces and then estimate joint forces, or more specifically, tibiofemoral joint forces. We're going to spend the majority of the talk talking about this MoCo portion of the pipeline, but we'll also briefly go over the beginning part of the pipeline as well. We freely share our experimental data in code. So we share a complete and open data set of cycling marker data with pedal forces. And we also share the setup files and code to create these musculoskeletal simulations using OpenSim MoCo, as well as some of the example results. So that, believe that link is going to be dropped into the chat where you can download this freely on SimTK. Now coming back to our pipeline, we're going to talk briefly about the beginning part of that pipeline. But the key here is that without good kinematics, the rest of the simulations fall apart. And that starts with experimental data collection. The experimental data collection was done in previous studies by my co-author, in which they used a commercial fit bike and proper bike fit techniques, as shown right here. Next, using OpenSim, for each participant, we created a participant-specific scaled model. And finally, we use OpenSim to get our kinematics. And although I'm only showing joint angles here for the hip, knee, and ankle in the sagittal plane, every degree of freedom in this model, we have resultant kinematics and joint angles for. And all these joint angles were compared to literature to ensure that all of our participants were producing joint angles within that normative range based on the existing literature. And now we can get to the OpenSim MoCo part of the talk. What I'll be showing here is J1, which is our baseline objective function, minimized with Opens and Moco to estimate muscle forces. When we look at J1, we see there are two terms. That first term is a term to minimize muscle excitations and joint actuators. We'll talk a little bit more in the second part of the talk about what these joint actuators are. And there we have a weight attached to this term. The second term is called auxiliary derivatives, and this is a term to minimize the additional muscle dynamics controls. So when we use Opens and Moco, we use implicit tendon dynamics mode. And when we do this, we get extra controls in the simulation. And it's best practice to minimize all controls in our simulation to avoid numerical singularities and improve convergence. And all this together makes up J1. And with J1, we estimate a lot of muscle forces. And this is just a subset of the muscle forces estimated with our model. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of these today, so we're going to go through a subset. We're going to look at the hamstrings right here. Now, let me walk you through these graphs. On the x-axis, we have the percent revolution of the crank cycle, and that starts at top dead center, or TDC. So that's when the crank is at 12 o'clock. As we move through the revolution, we go through 50% of the revolution, and we get to bottom dead center. So that is when our crank would be at 6 o'clock. Finally, when we come at 100% of the revolution, we come back to top dead center. On the y-axis, we have the muscle force in newtons. And I would like to point out that the scales for the y-axis for each of these muscles, for each of these graphs, is different. In our thick black line, we have the total force averaged across all participants. So this total force is the sum of the active force and the passive force put out by the muscle. And then in our blue line, we have the active force averaged across all participants and with the two standard deviations. And looking at these graphs, I want to point out a couple of things. So for one, when we look at the biceps femoris long head, so this is the graph on the far left, we see that there's a lot of active force being put out at top dead center, both at the beginning and at the end of the cycle. And based on experimental data and literature, we would expect the biceps femoris long head to be active later in the cycle, but not at top dead center. Now, as we look to the right side of the screen, when we see the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, what we notice is that when we look at that blue line, that active force line, the semimembranosus and semitendinosus aren't really putting out very much force at all, or active force. And so we would expect that there should be more active force coming from these muscles. This is when I would like to share that neuromuscular coordination may be regulated by joint pain. There is a really great experimental study in particular that I would like to share. And this is work done by Henriksen and their group. And they studied both healthy patients with and without knee pain and osteoarthritic patients. And while walking, they discovered with the presence of increased pain, there was a decreased peak knee moment. So knowing this and some work from other studies, we present J2, which is an alternative objective function minimized with Opens and Moco to estimate muscle forces. And when we look at J2, we see we have J1 as we had before. We also have this additional term, and its weight. And this additional term is to minimize the tibiofemoral forces. Now we can look back at our active forces. On the x-axis, as a reminder, we have the percent revolution of the crank cycle, starting at top dead center, moving through bottom dead center, and coming back to top dead center. And on the y-axis, we have the muscle force in newtons. And once again, our y-axis scales are different across the 4 different muscles here. In our solid line, we have the active force mean, so the active force averaged across all participants produced with J1, our baseline objective function. So this is what we just looked at before. In our dashed line, we have the active force averaged across all participants produced with J2, our alternative objective function. And so what do we notice? As far as the biceps femoris long head, we notice that we no longer have this issue of excessive force produced by the biceps femoris long head around top dead center, as we can see that clear drop. Also, when we look at the semimembranosus and semitendinosus on the right side of the screen, we see that this dash curve, so the active force mean with J2, is increased for both the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, showing some more muscle sharing across these muscles. And these muscle forces lead us to believe that J2 may result in a more physiologic simulation. Similarly, we can look at the tibiofemoral forces. This on the x-axis, once again, we have the crank cycle. And on the y-axis, we have the tibiofemoral force in newtons. In our solid blue line, we have the tibiofemoral force averaged across all participants produced with J1, our baseline objective function. In the dashed black line, we have our tibiofemoral force mean produced with J2, our alternative objective function. And there are a couple of features that I would like to point out here. When we go from J1 to J2, we see our average peak tibiofemoral force drop from about 2,000 newtons to about 1,200 newtons. And this much more closely matches in vivo instrumented joint data found in literature. Similarly, when we look around bottom dead center, we see that the tibiofemoral force produced with J2, our alternative objective function, has a more distinct second peak right around bottom dead center, once again agreeing more closely with the data found in literature. And finally, when we look at the peak tibiofemoral force and plot it against the power output of the cyclist, we see that power is a strong predictor of the tibiofemoral force in our alternative objective function. And this also much more closely agrees with literature. In summary, we shared our three-dimensional musculoskeletal modeling pipeline. And that pipeline starts with experimental data collection of 16 participants. And with a participant-specific scaled model and the motion capture data, we produce kinematics with inverse kinematics. We then use the residual reduction algorithm to produce kinematics in an adjusted model. Finally, we use OpenSimMoco, a direct collocation optimization method, in order to estimate muscle forces and tibiofemoral forces. And we freely share all of our data at SimTK at the link right here. And we strongly encourage and invite researchers to download these data and improve upon our work. Some potential areas include looking at alternate objective functions, as well as using these data for predictive simulation. I would like to give a massive thank you to my co-authors for really helping make this research happen. Thank you so much, Anthony, Carmichael, Monica, and Scott. I'd also like to thank Stanford Mechanical Engineering, the Neuromuscular Biomechanics Lab, and the WUSA Human Performance Alliance for funding. And now I'll take some questions.
Okay, great. Thanks for a super clear talk. We'll go ahead and answer. It looks like there's a question that came in. Feel free to add more questions right now into the Q&A. Once we're done, we could also start the second session a little bit earlier and then have more Q&A at the end. That works out. One question came in from Rajesh Govindan. Are EMG data required for developing an OpenSim model? If yes, at how many locations are EMG sensors required? You could also maybe talk about that in developing a MoCo pipeline, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with OpenSimMoco, that's optional to add to your model. So that is one of the inputs that you can use. However, in our simulations, we did not have EMG data. So we were comparing all EMG data to what was found, or all of our muscle activations to what was found in literature. Our model had 80 muscle tendon units, so 40 for each leg. So it would obviously be best, if possible, to measure all of these muscles, but some muscles are really hard to measure with EMG based on their locations in the body. I think there's been some interesting work that has done this EMG measurement in comparison.
Got a few more that came in. The first one I know you'll cover in the second half, but we can go ahead and answer it real quick in terms of Morgan Sangu was wondering how you measure external forces applied at the saddle.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're going to talk about that in the second part of the talk. But as like a small preview, that is those joint actuators that we looked at in the objective function. Because you're exactly right. We measured the reaction forces at the pedals, but we didn't measure those reaction forces at the pelvis. So we have to capture those.
Great. A question from Silas Persia. How was the pedal implemented in the simulation, and uh, how was the correct resistance of the pedal defined?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't address the resistance of the pedal, but during the experimental data collection, um, we had instrumented pedals, and each of the cyclists, their foot was like strapped really tightly in. And then that reaction force measured is applied to the calcaneus. So that is how we capture our reaction force at the pedals. But like you mentioned, we didn't capture that resistance at the crank.
Um, let's see. Maybe you can just say this real quick. Amin Komeli was wondering what range of cycling powers, cadence, and test duration were in the experimental data.
Yeah, our powers ran from 40 watts to 216 watts, so a really wide range to encompass that cycling literature. Our cadence ranged from 75 RPM to 99 RPM, which is pretty standard. And then what was the third part?
I'm sorry, pull it away.
Sorry.
Um, in terms of the test rate, like how long were they on
The
them?
test duration. Yeah. So we did 3-minute cycling bouts. And then the data that we analyzed was 2 minutes into the cycling bouts. So we kind of ignored those funky cycles that might be associated with startup and cycling. And then we looked at several consecutive cycles. But since there wasn't very much variance from cycle to cycle, for clarity, we present the one cycle at a time.
A question from Gilles Dufour. What's the difference between active force and total force?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our total force is the sum of all of the force being put out by the muscle. So that is a combination of the active force and the passive force. So these models will also have passive force that they are putting out. We'll look at that a little bit in the second part of the talk as well.
Great. A question from Alif Forazan Nafar. Can you explain the role of RRA in OpenSim, and particularly the algorithm that it uses?
Yeah, so to give like a brief overview of what RRA is doing, is RRA, or the residual reduction algorithm, seeks to minimize the dynamic inconsistency between the kinematic data, so our joint angles, and the kinetic data, so our measured reaction forces. And then it produces adjusted kinematics. Our kinematics were less than 1 degree different for each degree of freedom, so basically the same. And we have a dynamically adjusted model to go along with that better matches, and it's helping kind of account for some of the things we might not be measuring or errors in these data. There is some really great documentation on the OpenSim Confluence documentation. I'll be mentioning it later in the talk, and I would strongly encourage you to check out that Confluence page, because I think that would be able to give you a more detailed dive in that I can't quite explain right now.
Definitely. You're going to talk a little bit about muscle tendon parameters in the second half, but a question came in from a cat a lot. How did you make the models participant specific? So did you make changes in any muscle tendon parameters beyond scaling?
Yeah, we're also going to get to this in the second part of the talk. So that's great that everyone's having such relevant questions. So for the most part, we keep a lot of those parameters as is. This model was like a minimally adjusted version of the Lie Arnold model for high flexion. And they did a lot of really great validation work to kind of characterize those parameters. However, there were some small changes that we made to the model in terms of some minor model changes or fixes that came out about along the way, and to like some of those parameters like passive forces as well. I don't want to spoil too much from the second part of the talk since that's
Yeah.
a good part of it.